Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 832, and today is September 1st, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Obviously, there was only one show last week. I was doing a little bit of traveling, spending some time with family, which was very nice and relaxing, but now I am ready to get back at it. So I got some articles that I wrote last night for the Institute and a few things that I wanted to catch up on from last week that I thought were important stories, even if they aren't quite as timely as they would have been when we initially covered them. They are things I definitely want my audience to be aware of. So before I jump into it on today's show, just a couple of reminders. First, check out the Kyle Anzalone Show. We will be back with another episode of that show today at 4:45 Eastern Time. It is the top link in the show notes page, so very easy to find and subscribe to. Additionally, you could help out the show by following me on @ Kyle Anzalone_. I post all my work there, all the articles I write, all the shows I do, so a very good way to keep up with everything I got going on. And now let's jump into the news today. First up, here is an article I wrote for the Institute on August 25th. Poll: majority of Americans do not believe Trump can end wars in Ukraine and Gaza. A new poll shows that a majority of Americans do not believe President Donald Trump will be able to end the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel. The U.S. is the largest provider of military aid to Ukraine and Israel, giving Trump significant leverage over Kiev and Tel Aviv to bring the worst to an end. According to a poll conducted by Harvard and Harris, 59% of Americans said Trump would be unable to solve the war in Ukraine. When asked the same question about the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, 64% of respondents said Trump would be unable to end the conflict. While Americans are not confident that Trump could end the war in Ukraine, 2/3 support his effort to negotiate an end to the conflict. Trump met with Vladimir Putin on August 15th. During the summit, Trump and Putin discussed ending the war through territorial swaps, ruling out NATO membership for Kiev, and limiting Ukraine's arsenal. Ukrainian President Zelensky has rejected making any territorial concessions to Russia. Additionally, Zelensky and European leaders are demanding that Kiev receive an Article 5 style security pact with Western countries. The Harvard-Harris poll found that most Americans believe there is famine in Gaza, but blame Hamas for the famine. International human rights groups have accused Israel of intentionally creating a famine in Gaza. Tel Aviv is conducting a ruthless military campaign in the Strip. Additionally, the Palestinians living under the Israeli siege. Israel only allows a small amount of food to be distributed in Gaza, leading to an international watchdog group to declare a famine in the Strip. So I thought that was just interesting that, Americans do want ends to these conflicts, but they just don't think Trump could get it done. And there I largely agree with them. Next up, Trump floats renaming Department of Defense to Department of War. In a meeting with the South Korean President Donald Trump suggested renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Now, in a way, I kind of agree with Donald Trump here that the Pentagon doesn't engage in defense of this country. It engages in offensive and unnecessary wars around the globe. And so, in a sense, calling it the Department of Defense is a piece of propaganda. And so, renaming it to the Department of War will give the Americans more clarity every time the Department of War puts out a press release that this isn't about the defense of the homeland. This is about waging and maintaining our global empire. At the same time, it makes me a little bit nervous when Trump is talking about this, because I think from Trump's perspective, he wants to call it the Department of War as a way to make threats to other countries around the world. He likes to bully people so he could get better deals. Unfortunately for Trump, he kind of, even if his natural instinct is to avoid war, when he engages in this rhetoric, he tends to walk himself into a corner where the only solution is to go to war. And so we see heavy bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, bombing Iran, and potentially wars with Venezuela and Mexico, as all places Trump could really get himself involved, especially if he starts calling it the Department of War and feels that he has to make the department live up to its new name. I could definitely see that occurring. Next up, this one from Dave DeCamp, August 25th, antiwar.com. Zelensky wants $1 billion per month from NATO countries to buy U.S. weapons. So Zelensky said last week that he wants $1 billion per month from NATO countries to purchase U.S. weapons. NATO recently announced a scheme under which member states would commit to spending on U.S. weapons to ship to Ukraine, known as the Prioritized Ukraine Requirement List Initiative. So far, about $2 billion has been committed to the effort in pledges from the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Germany, and Canada. Zelensky said, "Our goal is to fill this program with no less than $1 billion every month." During a joint press release with the Norwegian Prime Minister in Ukraine, he added, "We also discussed our domestic drone production, joint opportunities with partners. Investments now can help only physically, but also force Russia to end this war." So during his visit, the Norwegian leader pledged that Norway would provide Ukraine with about $8.4 billion in aid for 2026, the same amount Norway pledged to support this year. Now, one thing that's important is I don't think this $1 billion will be enough to keep the Ukrainian military fighting. They've been receiving, I would say, 4 or 5 times that, at the very least, like, $4 to $5 billion a month in U.S. weapons. And then they need other financial support as well. They don't have enough money to fund their own government, to pay pensions and other welfare commitments, securities to their people, and so they're going to need a hell of a lot more money than this. Sure, $1 billion a month probably seems doable to Europe, and that's why they're using that figure, but I would guess that number is going to be far higher when it comes down to it. And who's going to bridge that gap? If it's the Americans, then Trump is going to be investing a lot of money, just like President Biden was, in fighting this war. Next up here, German leader mentally preparing for long war in Ukraine. I wrote this one on August 31st for antiwar.com. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said he hopes for a quick end to the Ukraine war, but is preparing himself for a prolonged conflict. The war in Ukraine has raged for 3.5 years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. When asked if he believes that a ceasefire could be established within the next year, Merz replied, "I'm mentally preparing myself for the fact that this war could drag on for a long time. We're trying to end this conflict as quickly as possible, but certainly not at the price of Ukraine's capitulation." And so this is the problem, as I go over in the article. You have Putin, who has the upper hand. He's demanding territorial concessions, Ukrainian neutrality, and denazification. Zelensky is refusing to do that, and the Europeans are backing Zelensky's hardline position. Of course, the Trump administration appears to be preparing to roll out economic penalties against Russia and its partners, believing that is going to help break Putin of his hardline position. But if Trump really wanted to end this war, he does have significant leverage over Zelensky. But rather than forcing Zelensky to soften his position to end the conflict, Trump continues to provide and send weapons to Ukraine. Even if those weapons are being bought by the Europeans, they are still coming out of American stockpiles and off American factory lines, where they could go to replenishing the U.S. stockpile that was depleted by the Biden administration, but that is not the step that the Trump administration is taking. During his interview, Merz stressed that the top priority is to keep the Ukrainians fighting. He said the number one priority is supporting the Ukrainian army so they could defend the country in the long term, the absolute priority, and we will begin doing that now. Washington recently approved sending and selling thousands of long-range air-launched cruise missiles to Ukraine, and Europe is expected to pay for those munitions. All right, This one here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, August 31st. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says Europe is drawing up precise plans for the U.S. bat troop deployment to Ukraine. So the European Commission President told the Financial Times that European countries are drawing up pretty precise plans for the potential deployment of troops to Ukraine as part of a future peace deal, an arrangement that Russia has made clear it will never accept. And as we've been saying on this show for some time, it seems pretty clear that the Europeans are doing this to try to sabotage Trump's effort to make peace. To Trump, I guess it sounds reasonable to have a sustained European with American backing force in Ukraine for the long term. But this was Russia's objection to Ukraine joining NATO. They don't want NATO troops in Ukraine. They don't want NATO troops on their border. And so if that's the European and the Ukrainian position, then Russia is going to take more territory in Ukraine, eventually force the collapse of the Ukrainian army, and then we'll be able to dictate terms to Kiev. Next up here, this article I wrote on August 25th for the Libertarian Institute. Trump hopes to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un this year. President Donald Trump met with the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and discussed improving ties with North Korea during a White House summit on Tuesday. Pyongyang has ruled out talks with Seoul and pledges to only engage with Washington if Trump drops the demand that North Korea denuclearize. So this is Trump's statement. I have a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un, North Korea. In fact, someday I'll see him. I look forward to seeing him. He was very good with me. We had 2 meetings. We had 2 summits. We got along great. I know him better than you do. I know him better than anybody, almost other than his sister. Trump met with North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un 3 times during his first administration. Lee asked Trump to leverage his relationship with Kim to improve ties on the Korean Peninsula. Lee suggested building a Trump Tower in North Korea and playing golf with Kim Jong-un. Trump said he would like to meet with Kim this year. At the end of the first administration, tensions on the Korean Peninsula were at a low point. Pyongyang and Washington were working to implement the steps agreed to during the 2018 Singapore summit. The U.S. and South Korea canceled most war games, and North Korea froze missile tests. However, during the 2019 summit in Hanoi, Trump allowed his then National Security Advisor John Bolton to demand that Kim agree to undergo Libyan-style denuclearization. Pyongyang often cites Libya, where dictator Muammar Gaddafi agreed to denuclearize and then was overthrown in a U.S.-backed revolution, as a reason for maintaining its nuclear deterrent. President Joe Biden took a more confrontational approach towards North Korea. The Biden administration resumed live-fire war games with South Korea and pushed Tokyo and Seoul into a trilateral military pact with Washington. In response, Kim resumed missile tests and signed a defense pact with Russia. North Korea provided weapons and soldiers for Russia's war with Ukraine. Additionally, Kim ruled out talks with South Korea and said North Korea no longer sought to reunify the Korean Peninsula. Trump said that ties with Pyongyang would not have deteriorated had he been president, and South Korean President Lee agreed. Over the past month, Pyongyang has ruled out talks with Seoul. North Korea argues that South Korea is subservient to the U.S. Kim Yo-jong, sister of Supreme Leader Kim and senior party official, said North Korea was still open to talks with the U.S. if Trump would drop his demand for denuclearization. I think it's unlikely Trump will do that unless he has staff and personnel around him who really want to get a deal done with North Korea. Then maybe they will talk him into it. Next up here, This one from Dave DeCamp, August 31st, antiwar.com. U.S. to deploy controversial Typhoon missile system to Japan for the first time. So this Typhoon missile system we have talked about quite a bit, as the U.S. has deployed it in Europe and the Philippines so far. The reason the Typhoon is so provocative is because it could launch Tomahawk missiles, which have a range exceeding of 1,000 miles, and also it's a land-based launcher that's concealed within a 40-foot shipping container. And so I'm sure from China, Russia's perspective, it makes it very difficult to track, and now we're deploying it in territory that, we can certainly fire on Chinese ships in the South China and East China seas, but also potentially hit targets in mainland China, something that I'm sure Beijing is going to be very unhappy with. Next up here, I just want to mention this. It got a lot of coverage. I'm sure most people are aware of it. I wrote it up last week at judgenap.com. Israel massacres journalists and rescue workers with double tap strike on a hospital. And so there were at least 2 or 3 attacks carried out. It seems the first one was an airstrike followed up by maybe 2 tank shells fired on a stairwell of the Nasser hospital in southern Gaza. And the target was clearly journalists. 5 journalists in total were killed, including freelance journalists that work with the AP, Reuters, and Al Jazeera. And so this was another massacre. One of the reasons that this one was got so much media attention is the second strike was caught on camera. And so people were able to see, rescue workers attempting to rescue injured journalists being killed. And those journalists working for the AP and Reuters in particular make it so that it just, the narrative that, what's going on here is that, this was targeting Hamas just doesn't resonate with people. And so this was some really bad PR for the Israelis. They even had to walk it back and apologize a little bit. However, it doesn't seem like it's going to impact the U.S.-Israeli relationship. All right, next up here, this article I wrote on August 31st at the Libertarian Institute. IDF report determined Operation Gideon's Chariots failed to achieve objectives. The Israeli military concluded that its month-long objective, recent months-long operations, was a failure, and Hamas continues to have the conditions needed to win. So, the IDF report was obtained by Israel's Channel 12. It said Israel made every possible mistake, waging a war contrary to its own doctrines of warfare. It added that Hamas had every condition to survive and win. The 2 main objectives of the months-long operation, dubbed Gideon's Chariots, were to release the remaining Israeli hostages and defeat Hamas. Hamas continues to hold 50 Israelis and fight against the IDF occupation. Gideon's Chariots ran from mid-May through early August. The IDF determined that one of the main factors contributing to the failure was the lack of effective humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. The widespread starvation created a global backlash and an increase in support for the Palestinians. During Gideon's Chariots, the only aid agency that was allowed to distribute food in Gaza was the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The GHF sites are located far from population centers, and over 2,000 Palestinians have been killed at or while traveling to distribution points. The GHF did not deliver enough food to feed the population, and the most vulnerable cannot travel to the aid distribution sites. The Israeli policy created a famine for hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza, and that number is likely to increase to the millions over the next month. Next up here, one more on Gaza, actually. Israeli officials say Israel may halt meager aid entering northern Gaza amid famine. So an Israeli official told the AP on Saturday that Israel is planning to halt or slow the meager aid supplies that are entering Gaza City and other parts of northern Gaza as Israel is expanding its military offensive amid a famine in the area. The UN-backed Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC, and the UN-funded Famine U.S.-funded Famine Early Network System, or FUSENet, have both determined that famine is taking place in the Gaza, which includes Gaza City. In the areas north of Gaza City, the hunger monitor says famine is likely occurring and may actually be worse, but the lack of data makes it impossible to declare an official famine. The Israeli officials speaking to the AP said that in the coming days, Israel would stop allowing airdrops over Gaza City and start limiting the number of trucks that can enter northern Gaza. And steps will be taken to ensure more. The steps are taken to ensure more people will starve to death. A day earlier, the Israeli military said it would stop the so-called humanitarian pauses of its attacks in Gaza City and declared the entire city as a combat zone. So the situation in Gaza is going to get a lot worse this week. Next up here, Israel considers annexing parts of the occupied West Bank in response to a move to recognize a Palestinian state. And so, as I mentioned in the article before, Israel has received a lot of global pushback because of its operation in Gaza that has led to the widespread starvation in the Strip. This has provoked a lot of countries, and specifically the UK. They said they were going to recognize a Palestinian state, even though that Palestinian state would be the West Bank and its government, the Palestinian Authority, and really doesn't have anything to do with Gaza. But the really negative publicity, the starvation of children in Gaza, has provoked a lot of European countries, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, all to declare that they are going to recognize a Palestinian state at the upcoming UN General Assembly. That's part of the PR failure that they talked about, when the IDF talked about with Operations Gideon's Chariots. And so now Israel, I guess, is rushing to annex parts of the West Bank to make it true that you can't really have a Palestinian state if it's just a non-continuous chunk of territory of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. All right, next up, this article I wrote for JudgeSnap.com. Hezbollah leader refuses to disarm, and so the leader of Hezbollah gave a speech saying that the group would not lay down their weapons. Israel is demanding, the U.S. is demanding and putting a lot of pressure on the government in Beirut to disarm Hezbollah. The Lebanese government appears to be going along with the plan. Israel says that they are going to help them. I'm worried that this is going to kick off some major fighting in Lebanon, not just between Hezbollah and Syria, but potentially even between Hezbollah and other Lebanese groups. All right, so Dave wrote this one last week that Syria's al-Qaeda leader turned president to visit New York to address the UN General Assembly. So the UN General Assembly is going to kick off on September 22nd, and one of the guests coming to the United States for that meeting is none other than Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, who now calls himself, he's rebranded himself from jihadist to president and goes by Ahmed al-Shara. And I cannot believe he's going to be welcomed to New York City, the site of the 9/11 attacks, which of course inspired al-Shara to join up with al-Qaeda and fight for al-Qaeda in Iraq against the United States. It's absolutely sick and disgusting. All right, so next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, important story. Houthi leader vows attacks on Israel will continue after Israeli killing of Yemeni prime minister. So the leader of Yemen's Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, vowed on Sunday that the campaign against Israel that was launched in support of the Palestinians in Gaza would continue despite the assassination of the prime minister of the Houthi-led Yemeni government. So Abu Malik al-Houthi said in a speech where he condemned the violence against the family of Prime Minister Ahmed al-Rawani and other government ministers who were killed by an Israeli attack on August 28th. Yemen's position towards the Palestinian people is firm and cannot be reversed. Our people say to the Palestinian people, we are with you and we support you. The military path in targeting the Israeli enemy, whether with missiles, drones, or naval blockade, is continuous and unwavering. So the prime minister was a civilian official who was not considered a part of al-Houthis inner circle. He was tasked with running day-to-day affairs in Sana'a and other areas of the Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is about 70 to 80% of where the Yemeni population lives. The Houthis have been the governing authority in the area since 2014, when they first took power in Sana'a, after ousting a U.S. and Saudi bad government, which a U.S. bad Saudi UAE coalition attempted and failed to reinstall in a brutal war from 2012 to 2015. A senior Ansar Allah official suggested that the Houthis could escalate attacks on Israel in response to a killing of the prime minister. The Houthis are known for their resilience and did not break down in the face of a very heavy U.S. bombing campaign that the Trump administration conducted from March 15th to May 6th, which killed more than 250 civilians. The U.S. gave up trying to get the Houthis to stop their attacks on Israel and their blockade of Israeli shipping, and agreed to a ceasefire with the group. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu threatened to kill more senior Yemeni officials at a cabinet meeting on Sunday. So again, this is all likely to escalate. And Dave DeCamp has an important story here. As we talked about last week on the Kyle Anzalone show, Dave is really one of the only journalists in the United States even doing any work to cover the situation in Somalia. And Dave has been able to report that the U.S. has now conducted a record number of attacks in Somalia and recently engaged in a 2-week air campaign against an ISIS affiliate in Somalia. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Don't forget to check out the Kyle Anzalone show today at 4:45 Eastern Time. Thanks, everyone.